Okay, so we have made it to the final video in the section on unplugging from the matrix, and we are going to discuss pornography, sexuality, and restoring healthy intimacy. What a topic to dive into. This could be an hour-long talk in of itself, and there is really so much to discuss, and we're going to keep it simple and straightforward. There's a number of key things that I want to share with you on this topic. When it comes to pornography, this is one of the biggest issues, really one of the biggest epidemics plaguing the developmental process in particularly young boys becoming adolescents, becoming adults, and related to healthy sexuality, sexual distortions, and what I call the weaponization of sexuality through high-speed internet pornography. And in my book, The Addiction-Free Lifestyle, I did an entire chapter on pornography and the effects that it has psychologically, emotionally, developmentally, and also neurologically. There have been so many research, scientists, doctors, clinicians, therapists, coaches, so many people that have done deep research into the effects that pornography has on all these areas of our life, our developmental process, and also the effects that it has on our brain. And so I want to share with you some statistics that I wrote down in my book on that chapter on pornography. And it's quite staggering. It's quite alarming. So these stats were derived from an article called Pornography Facts and Statistics by the Recovery Village editor Megan Hill. 25% of search engine requests are related to sex. 35% of downloads from the internet are pornographic. 40 million Americans say they regularly visit porn sites. 70% of men aged 18 to 24 visit a porn site at least once a month. The largest consumer group of online porn is men between the ages of 35 and 49. Wow. 1/3 of all internet porn users are women. That's pretty interesting. Sunday is the most popular day of the week for viewing porn. Okay, it's not that surprising. Thanksgiving is the most popular day of the year for viewing porn. Okay. Don't even know what to make of that, but that is just a little bit of the statistics around pornography as far as the accessibility and the percentage of people, particularly men, that use pornography regularly. Now, in all transparency, I also want to say that there is no judgment when it comes to this subject or any of the subjects that we talk about. As a man, I have also experienced this issue in my younger years, in my early adult years. I know firsthand the effects that this has had neurologically on my brainwave state, on my neurochemistry, particularly the dopaminergic system, the reward and pleasure pathway circuitry of the brain. I also know firsthand the effects that it's had on my own sexuality, my perception of intimacy, my perception of sexuality, and how that's also bled itself into my intimate relationships over the years. I've had to go through a bit of a reset process myself and a redevelopment process of what I call healthy intimacy, healthy sexuality, and deprogramming from pornographic programming. This is a deep topic, and it's quite alarming when I really not only go over the statistics, but I really take an objective and sober look at how widespread this issue is. Now, there's a section in the book called Your Brain on Porn. And so there's an incredible amount of research information on the effects that pornography has on our physical brain and our neurotransmitter set. And so it would be belaboring the point to go really deep into the dopaminergic system and just kind of repeat so much of what we talked about before. You already kind of get the gist. Now, the thing with pornography in particular is that it's what's called a hypernormal stimuli. So it hyperstimulates the dopamine receptor sites. And like we talked about in the last video, It has to do with the entertainment entrainment aspect of our brainwave states and plugging our consciousness into a hyper normalize or hyper stimuli of dopamine. So our brain essentially is flooded with a hypernormal, that's a technical term, hypernormal, a hyper amount of dopamine that is based on fantasy, right? Because again, dopamine in its inappropriate imbalance starts to drive fantasy. It starts to drive fantastical future anticipation. And the problem with this is that it's always based on a fantasy. It's not based on reality. And because the brain does not have context for what's real and what's not, it's just signaling neurochemistry. And our physiology and our biology is emitting sensations based on that. The context is missing. Now, there's something really important that I want to mention about this from a physiological perspective. There's something called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Porn-induced erectile dysfunction. There's some alarming statistics that I went over almost 10 years ago. Two things. One, with fertility rates among men. This is, by the way, this is over a decade ago that I found these statistics, that there's a 50% decrease in fertility among men. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. You have to look at environmental contaminants, toxins, xenoestrogens, the increase of estrogen, the decrease of testosterone. That has a major effect as well. But then pornography and the excessive masturbation and the releasing of our seminal fluids, particularly through masturbation, and also tied to pornography in particular, it sets up a feedback loop within the brain. And again, it's always chasing pleasure to avoid pain. And then what comes along with that as well is the emotional signature of shame and guilt. And this is a big problem, right? Whenever a man watches porn or develops a pornography addiction and a masturbation addiction, what follows the climax is usually shame and guilt. And then what do? We have to medicate it. We have to stuff it down. We don't want to feel that. So then it leads to other addictive tendencies as well. Now let's return back to this thing on porn-induced erectile dysfunction. I don't know the exact statistics and the numbers, but what I can say is there is a massive amount of men that are not able to get it up. I've heard this from both women. I've heard it from both men in closed circles, closed conversations. And this is a source of a lot of guilt, a source of a lot of shame, and a source of a lot of pressure to perform. And a lot of men don't really fully recognize where this is coming from, where the downstream effects of this thing's coming from. They think it's just because of stress. And that also is another thing that leads to excessive masturbation and pornography as a way to manage and release the pressure valve of the stress they feel in their life. And it just has a vicious cycle, right? So there's so many studies that have been done to show that when you hyperproduce dopamine in an artificial sense, particularly through pornography, this also, by the way, is the same when you have all these other dopaminergic stimulating habits, these addiction habits. It also has a similar effect, but nothing is more pronounced in this regard than a pornography addiction. Two things. The actual physiological effect that's happening, because, when we think of testosterone, we think from a male perspective, testosterone is the driving force of our sexuality. To have an erection, to have a vibrant, vital, kind of virile sexual life. So testosterone's a major player. Now, when we're exhausting our dopamine reserves, that also diminishes our testosterone. Testosterone and dopamine are actually tied very closely together because dopamine manages and governs our drive, our willpower, and really our virility, and also our adrenal health as well. So when we're diminishing our dopamine reserves, we're also diminishing our testosterone, our vital life force through the excessive release of our seminal fluids. So many other things of that nature. Now, there's also another thing both cognitively and psycho-emotionally, if you will. I would even say psycho-spiritually, which is a bigger topic. When a man has developed the addiction to pornography, they're getting all this novelty of fantastical or fantasy-based sexual experiences. And, you know, it's like the video game thing that I discussed in the last video. At first, your sensitivity is low, so your tolerance is low, so you get more of a sensation from, you know, from whatever you're looking at. It could be benign, it could be kind of just not that extreme, but the more you take that in and the more you repeat that pattern, you need a lot more of it to get the same effect. And you also need a diversity of visual experiences that get a bit more extreme. And then also what's interesting is that you start to, kind of similar to dating sites in a sense, is that you have a whole catalog of experiences, of potential videos and different situations that you have immediate access to that will let you get off from it, both in the release process, the seminal release through masturbation, also get off dopaminergically. And then you need more and more and more of it just to get the same effect. Your dopamine system goes below baseline, and it just becomes the vicious cycle that we've talked about, the pain, pleasure, seesaw balance. And your brain is always trying to get back to a state of homeostasis. And if you don't reset for at least 30 days, then it's going to lead to further challenges. So the erectile dysfunction, the porn-induced erectile dysfunction thing, is both neurological, it's physiological, but it's also psychological as well, because when you are now with a woman, you're in a real intimate situation with a woman, it can't really compare to the context that your brain has adapted itself to in the virtual reality interface. And also in a real situation with a real human being, there's a lot more that goes into it, right? The fantasy in a porn situation where a guy just meets a girl and talks her up and then brings her back to his place and has this whole experience, right? That's a fantasy. That's a fantasy. That's not real. That's not how it typically happens, right? There's a whole process. There's a bonding process. There's a emotional. There's a whole human experience that goes into, a sexual encounter, and in most cases there's a human-to-human bonding process that has to happen, and it just sets us up for a whole cascade of problems. Both the person who has the addiction and the other person who is the recipient of that other experience. It's a long topic. We could unpack it, from multiple perspectives, but I just want to drive this point too, is that if a man in particular has this problem and then he's with a woman and he's not able to become erect because he has a case of porn-induced erectile dysfunction, it's because the context is misplaced. His brain has set up a context based on a virtual reality fantasy that psychosexually means psychologically connected to his sexuality. The thoughts and the visuals that his brain has entrained to directly affects his ability to be aroused, essentially, right, through the autonomic nervous system. And so it doesn't translate in real time. And this is essentially what's going on in this case. So there's multiple things that have to happen. There has to be a complete reset process altogether from pornography, and starting to do a self-analysis, a self-inventory psychologically on all the patterns that have been developed, the scenes in the movies that have been obsessed over, that have been ingrained and patterned in that person's thought process. That all has to be deprogrammed and has to be brought back into normalcy, brought back into a state of reality. There has to be a reorientation with the person. This could be a man or a woman, but just typically with men in this case. There has to be a reorientation with their sense of sexuality, and also intimacy, because that's what this all comes down to. It all comes down to intimacy with one's own self, with their own sexual patterns, their sexual programming, and also a desire for true connection, because sexual addiction and pornography addiction is ultimately at a deeper level, and it's avoidance of true intimacy. There is no intimacy in that case. There's the physical, sexual intimacy, if you want to call it that, but there's no real like humanity in it, right? It's more taking advantage and objectifying another human being for one's own gratification, and that is, that's essentially what it is. And that doesn't play out very well for either party involved. So there has to be a reorientation towards one's own sexuality and their desire for true intimacy. And this is also why the shame and the guilt manifests itself as a feedback from their nervous system, from their heart, really, from their conscience, to let them know that, hey, this is actually a maladaptive pattern, and this is taking you further and further away from your humanity, and it also has negative consequences for the other people involved in these experiences. So with all that, and there has to be a nutritional approach as well, similar to the social media approach, to reboot the brain's neurotransmitter system, to get it back online and start re-engaging with reality, right? And dispelling from the fantasy that's been generated through these patterns. Now, the last piece that I want to just talk about here, that I basically just mentioned, is that it's a return back to connection with oneself and return back to connection with another human being. I've mentioned this before in prior videos. I'll mention it again here. The thing that makes an addiction really an addiction in of itself is the immediate access to dopamine that it has with the least amount of effort required. Now, in reality, for a man to be able to engage with a woman sexually, there's a bit of a process that goes along with that, right? You have to actually connect with the person. You have to talk with the person. You have to be able to open yourself enough to be able to actually have a real, genuine connection. And there's a whole process that goes into it, right? The thing with pornography in particular is that you can immediately go on any website and you don't have to put yourself out there. You don't have to work on yourself. You don't have to go through any of your insecurities or emit any form of courage to overcome any of these insecurities. You don't have to put yourself out there. You can hide away behind your computer screen and you can get a flood dose of dopamine signaling the reward for something that you didn't even put effort towards, right? This is the maladaptive aspect of addiction. And in this case, it's maybe one of the biggest issues when it comes to this. I mean, when it comes to pornography addiction, this is held behind closed doors. You don't really notice on the streets of somebody that would have a pornography addiction versus someone that has maybe a high cocaine addiction or methamphetamines addiction or an alcoholic or somebody who's chain smoking cigarettes or things of that nature. Somebody has a food addiction, maybe they're overweight or they have acne on their skin. It doesn't manifest itself in the obvious ways that we would associate other things of like other known addictions, but people are walking around harboring the effects of it internally mostly. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. There's more I could keep going on about this, but you get the point. The video is already getting about almost 20 minutes, but it's an important topic. It's a critically important topic to face in our society and face within ourselves if we're dealing with this or we know somebody who's dealing with this issue. I certainly have in the past, and I know what it's like, and I also know what it feels like to overcome it. And it's going to take courage, and it's going to take honesty, and it's going to take a particular approach to help your brain reboot, and then to also help you discipline yourself to remove the virtual interface, in this case pornography, and start reconnecting back to your own innate sexuality, which is really your vital life force. When a man is excessively masturbating and releasing his seminal fluids, He's giving himself away, essentially, because then he becomes less of himself. So his motivation, his willpower, his drive, it all diminishes, and this shows up in a myriad of ways. There's a great book by Napoleon Hill. It's a classic book in personal development. It's called Think and Grow Rich. And there's a chapter in that book on sexual transmutation. This is the key to overcome this interpersonally, is that you have to transmute the craving and the trigger and the urge, whether it's to masturbate or watch pornography or whatever. You have to transmute, meaning transform that urge and redirect it into something that's actually meaningful, like working out, for example. Men need to lift heavy things. This is one thing that I've realized over the years. Men, because we're based on testosterone hormonally, we need to exert effort towards things to grow and develop and oppose resistance that we create for ourselves in order to grow. If we're masturbating all the time, we're leaking our vital life force energy, we're leaking our motivation, and we're probably on our computer all the time, and we're being more passive and lethargic, and we become more effeminate, we become more emotional and more unstable, and that is not going to help any men if they actually want to have a viable love partner, sexual partner, whatever it is. That's not going to create magnetism or attractiveness. And so in that book, Napoleon Hill talks about this. If a man can learn to master his root chakra, his sexual energy, and he can learn to circulate that through his body, through his breath, and how he conducts himself and how he manages his energy through the day and redirects it towards maybe building a business, pursuing goals, fitness goals, health goals, whatever it may be, and turns that craving into purpose, then that man can be a masterful human being. He can master his urges. And then here's the other thing. When you are with a woman, you can actually give of yourself. You can give all that energy to a woman, and it can be a profound experience, not just in the pleasurable aspect of the sexual, the physical sexual, let's say, sensation, which is a big thing too. Because the more you masturbate and the more you watch pornography, you start to numb out. It actually numbs out your sensitivity, and that's part of why it's hard to get aroused, because your sensitivity is essentially numb, right? That's not great. That's not good for anybody, right? We don't want to be numbed out sexually. And so it increases your sensitivity, but it also makes you more virile. It makes you stronger. In all respects. Now, what was the other point I wanted to mention with that? Yeah, I'll just say it this way. It just makes you a stronger version of yourself, and you're actually able to manage your stress response. Your stress response. Let me drink some water. Your stress response much more effectively, and you don't need these temporary dopaminergic gratifying coping mechanisms in order to manage stress. You can transmute the stress by shifting your energy and transferring those lower level frequency temptations into long-term goal pursuits. So that's a lot. We've talked about a lot, and I think you get the point. The last thing to just drive in here is restoring healthy intimacy. Some of the biggest problems in the world really are stemmed from the lack of healthy intimacy and the lack of empathic connection between two human beings intimately. This is certainly the biggest problem when it comes to relationships. So I would just really advise, if you're going through this, go through the protocols, really dedicate yourself to this. There is no moderate dose of pornography, by the way. There is no safe dose or moderate dose that's good for you. Pornography is net negative all the way together. It distorts our sexuality, it distorts our perception of reality, and it distorts our brain chemistry, which also distorts our interpretation of reality. Fantasy versus reality, and it also makes it so that a real sexual experience with another human being is not as pleasurable or desirable as the fantasy that we see on our computer screen according to the brain. We need to reroute that altogether. So I think I'll leave it there. That's as much as I wanted to share in this video. If you want to go deeper, get the book, The Addiction-Free Lifestyle, and check out the chapter on pornography, sexuality, and restoring healthy intimacy. And there's a lot of suggestions and advice to help you through it. But just doing the reset and following this protocol all the way out is going to support you immensely in this recovery process.